What if I told you that in 12 days, one country lost more ships than most navies own in total, and its own government's response was to order more motorcycles? Stay with me, because this story gets stranger the deeper you go. Before we go further, do me one favor. Hit that like button right now, not at the end, right now, because it tells YouTube this story deserves to be seen by more people. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we break down exactly this kind of hidden war, the one happening away from the front lines, every single week. Now let's get into it. On the night of July 17th, 2026, something happened in the Black Sea that most news channels barely mentioned. 12 ships were hit, 9 cargo vessels, 1 oil tanker, 1 gas carrier, and a tugboat, all of them attacked by Ukrainian drone units operating far from any battlefield you'd recognize. The man in charge of those units, Robert Brovdy, announced the number publicly. And when you add it to everything else his forces claim to have done over the previous 11 days, the total comes out to a number that should stop you in your tracks. 159 vessels struck in 12 days. Read that again. Not 12 ships. 159. In less than 2 weeks. Now, if you're like most people, your first instinct is to shrug. Ships get hit in wars. That's what wars do. But this number isn't just a number. It's a receipt. It's proof of something much bigger. Proof that a navy which is supposed to control its own coastline can no longer protect the ships sailing through it. Proof that a country sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on the planet is struggling to move fuel to a piece of land it has physically occupied for over a decade. And here's the part that makes this whole story worth telling. On that exact same day, July 17th, while all of this was happening, Russia's own Ministry of Defense sat down for an official meeting and decided that what its army really needed was more motorcycles. I promise you, we're coming back to the motorcycles. Keep that image in your head, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why it matters more than it sounds. It's important to be honest with you from the start. A lot of what you're about to hear comes from Ukrainian military sources. That doesn't mean it's false, but it does mean we should treat it the way you'd treat any claim from a side that's actively fighting a war. I'll tell you clearly which parts are confirmed by outside data and which parts are still just claims. The difference matters here more than almost any other story we've covered. Let's start with what Ukraine says it has actually been doing. They're calling it a large-scale campaign that began around July 6th. In just the first 10 days, Ukrainian forces claim they struck 147 vessels. Most of those hits, 117 of them, happened in the Sea of Azov, with the remaining 30 in the Black Sea. Then, on July 17th alone, 12 more ships were added to that list, all in the Black Sea, pushing the running total past 150. Now here's something worth noticing. Look at what kind of ships are actually being hit. On July 16th, the targets were mostly fuel carriers, 5 oil tankers, 1 liquefied gas carrier, 3 bulk cargo ships, and 2 tugboats. The very next day, the pattern shifted toward ordinary dry cargo vessels, 9 out of 12 targets. This isn't random. This isn't a group of drone pilots picking flashy, dramatic targets to post online. This looks like a team working through an actual list, methodically, target by target, and notice what's missing from that list entirely. Warships. Not one Russian warship shows up in these reports. Ukraine, for all its aggressive drone activity, has spent this entire month avoiding a direct fight with Russia's navy. Instead, it has been quietly, patiently strangling Russia's ability to move cargo across the water. Here's something that surprised even seasoned military analysts. The stated goal isn't to sink these ships, it's to disable them. Watch the footage from these strikes, if you can find it. The drones aren't aiming for the hull, where a direct hit could sink a ship in minutes. They're aiming for the bridge, the control room, the antenna arrays. They're going for the brain of the ship, not its body. Why would anyone do that instead of just sinking the ship outright? Because a sunken tanker is a disaster in every sense of the word. It's an environmental catastrophe. It becomes an international insurance nightmare. And worst of all for Ukraine, it hands Russia a powerful piece of propaganda. Footage of a burning, sinking ship, dead sailors, oil spilling into the sea. That story writes itself, and it doesn't favor Kiev. But a ship with a burned-out bridge and destroyed navigation equipment? That's something else entirely. That ship can't move. It can't be repaired at sea. It needs a tow, it needs a repair yard, it needs a new crew, it needs a berth to sit in for months, and it needs an insurance company willing to pay for all of that. One outcome makes headlines for a day. The other outcome bleeds money for months quietly in the background, where nobody's watching. Ukraine has been careful to frame these attacks as legitimate under international law. Deputy Prime Minister Alexei Kuleba reportedly sent formal correspondence to the International Maritime Organization, arguing that vessels transporting sanctioned oil in violation of international restrictions shouldn't be treated as ordinary commercial ships. He also pointed out that Russia itself has struck dozens of merchant vessels since the war began in 2022. Moscow's response, through Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, was to call the Ukrainian strikes an act of terrorism. You can believe both of these things are politically motivated. You can be skeptical of both governments. But here's the one fact that cuts through all the noise. Only one side's shipping has actually stopped moving. And that side isn't Ukraine. Pravda has claimed that traffic through the Kerch Strait, the narrow waterway connecting the Sea of Azov to the Black Sea, has effectively halted. Ukrainian sources also claim the Azov-Don shipping canal has been shut down right at the start of the 2026-27 agricultural season, and that up to 30% of Russian grain exports move through waterways crossing Rostov Oblast. Again, these are claims from a side actively fighting the war. Treat them carefully. But here's what makes them different from a lot of wartime propaganda. They're checkable. Anybody with access to commercial vessel tracking data can verify whether ships are actually moving through those waterways or not. Now let's talk about the part of this story that turns it from a military headline into something that actually touches your life, wherever you're watching from. Bloomberg's independent vessel tracking data, not Ukrainian, not Russian, completely separate from either government, shows that Russia shipped 4.21 million barrels of seaborne crude oil per day over the 4 weeks leading up to July 12th. That is essentially the highest export level since the war began. At first glance, that sounds like a win for Russia. Record oil exports, more money flowing in. But it's actually a symptom of something going badly wrong. Here's why. Ukraine has been running a separate parallel campaign against Russian oil refineries deep inside Russian territory. That campaign has pushed Russia's domestic refining output down to its lowest level in 21 years. Oil that Russia used to process at home, turning it into diesel and gasoline it could sell at a healthy profit, now has to be shipped out of the country raw, unprocessed, sold at a steep discount. And to make matters worse, the ships carrying that oil aren't unloading fast enough anymore. According to the same Bloomberg data, Russian crude that has already been loaded onto ships but hasn't yet reached a buyer is sitting at roughly 135 million barrels. That's close to the highest backlog seen since early 2026. 5 tankers are anchored off the coast of Egypt. 5 more are idling near Singapore. An entire month's worth of oil exports is just sitting on the ocean, going nowhere, earning nothing. And here's the number that really tells the story. The total value of Russia's 4-week seaborne oil exports has slipped back toward $1.7 billion, down from a peak closer to $2.5 billion earlier this year. Read that carefully. Export volume is up. Export value is down. That is the exact signature of a producer losing pricing power in real time, in front of everyone watching. So think about what Ukraine's drone campaign is really doing here. It isn't stopping the oil from flowing. It's attacking the machinery that moves that oil. Every tanker with a destroyed bridge is one less working ship in a fleet that's already too slow to clear its own backlog. Every tugboat destroyed is one less rescue vessel available for the next damaged tanker. Every specialized gas carrier taken out of action is a ship that can take up to 2 years to replace, with no easy substitute available on the open market. Russia built what people call the shadow fleet, a collection of older ships, hidden ownership structures, and insurance from countries outside Western sanctions, specifically to get around international restrictions on its oil trade. It worked because it was cheap. It worked because there were plenty of these ships available. Ukraine's strategy seems to understand something clever. You don't need to sanction a workaround if you can simply make the workaround expensive to run. Before we go further, let's pause for a second. CTA, done a little differently this time. If this kind of deep, connect-the-dots analysis is what you actually came here for, drop a comment telling me which part surprised you the most so far, the ship strikes or the oil numbers. I read every comment, and it genuinely shapes what we cover next. And if you haven't already, subscribe now, because the next section is where this story gets personal for you, wherever you're sitting. Now let's talk about why this actually matters to you, even if you've never thought about Russian oil tankers in your life. On July 17th, Brent crude oil was trading around $85 to $86 a barrel. WTI crude was above $80. Those are elevated prices. And elevated oil prices matter to every single household in the world through the price at the gas pump, and through the inflation numbers that shape decisions made by central banks. Deutsche Bank had already flagged crude oil near $85 as a serious concern for inflation and interest rate policy. But here's the twist, and I want you to really sit with this one. Almost none of that price increase is actually because of Ukraine's ship strike campaign. The real driver of oil prices that week was escalating tension between the United States and Iran, and fears of disruption around the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz, a completely separate part of the world. Ukraine has hit 159 vessels in 12 days, and the global oil market has barely reacted. Why? Because whether by careful design or simple luck, Ukraine is running a campaign that damages Russian revenue without actually removing Russian oil barrels from the global market. The oil is still shipping. It's just shipping slower, at a steeper discount, and at a much higher cost to Moscow specifically. Now layer that on top of an oil market that's already oversupplied. The International Energy Agency has been forecasting a global surplus somewhere between 3.5 and 4 million barrels a day. American oil production is heading toward a record 13.6 million barrels a day. OPEC Plus is adding another 188,000 barrels a day of supply starting in August. Put all of that together, and you get something genuinely rare in the history of economic warfare. Ukraine is running a campaign that hurts its target, Russia, far more than it hurts anyone watching from the outside, including you, wherever you are. But here's the honest warning. Nobody knows how long that balance holds, if a strike goes wrong, if a fully loaded tanker breaks apart in the Kerch Strait and causes a genuine environmental disaster, if insurers start pricing the Black Sea the same way they price the Red Sea right now, as a serious, active war risk zone, everything changes overnight. There's already a small hint of that danger. A Chevron-chartered tanker, the Yasa Polaris, was reportedly struck near the CPC terminal on July 7th. That terminal handles Kazakh crude oil, not Russian oil, and that route carries more than 1% of the entire world's oil supply. Nobody was hurt in that incident, and the reported damage was minimal, but that's exactly the seam where this quiet, contained war could suddenly become everyone's problem, all at once. It's worth watching more closely than the ship count itself. Now, let's bring this back to the title of this video and to the motorcycles, because ships weren't the only thing Russia lost that week. On the night of July 16th, Ukrainian long-range drones reached a target deep inside Russia, a place called Engels 2, located in Saratov Oblast, hundreds of kilometers from the front line. Russian telegram channels reported it first. Residents described low-flying drones, followed by explosions, followed by fire. Independent monitoring channels geolocated the blaze to the airfield itself. On July 17th, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, confirmed that its drones had flown roughly 800 kilometers to reach the target and had destroyed a Tu-95 strategic bomber, with the tail section torn completely off. President Zelensky publicly confirmed the strike and called it, in his words, another long-range sanction against Russia's war machine. Engels 2 is home to two of Russia's most important bomber regiments. It hosts the Tu-95MS and the Tu-160, the very aircraft that launched the cruise missiles that have hit apartment blocks full of ordinary Ukrainian civilians. The base also stores ammunition, fuel, and maintenance equipment. Here's a fact that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. By most reliable estimates, Russia has something in the range of 45 Tu-95MS bombers, plus around 18 modernized variants. The factory that produced them closed in 1993. There's no active production line. There's no replacement pipeline. Every single one of these aircraft that burns is gone permanently, forever, with no way to rebuild it. And this wasn't the first time. Back in June 2025, an Operation Ukraine called Spiderweb destroyed at least 8 of these bombers using small first-person view drones that had been smuggled deep into Russian territory hidden inside civilian trucks. Ukraine's own estimate of the damage from that operation was around $7 billion, and it claimed to have disabled roughly a third of Russia's entire fleet of cruise missile-carrying aircraft. Now here's the part that genuinely stopped me when I first read it. After losing those bombers in 2025, what did Russia do in response? It expanded Engels 2. It built more parking space for more aircraft, at the exact same base that had just been hit. Read that again. The response to losing bombers on the ground was to build more room to park bombers on the ground, at the same vulnerable location. That same night, in a completely different part of the war, Ukraine's National Guard says its Special Operations Unit, known as Omega, destroyed a Su-24M frontline bomber sitting at Saki Air Base in occupied Crimea, using 2 small drones, one aimed at the nose of the aircraft, one aimed straight at the fuel tank. According to reports, this happened while the aircraft was actually preparing to take off on July 15th. A few days earlier, on the same general stretch of front, an Mi-28 attack helicopter was destroyed in Belgorod Oblast. And on July 8th, a Su-35 fighter jet was reportedly shot down. Think about that lineup for a second. A fighter jet, an attack helicopter, a frontline bomber, and a strategic bomber, all lost within the span of about 10 days. And out of all of them, only one was actually destroyed while in the air. The rest were caught sitting still on the ground, supposedly safe, deep behind what Russia assumed was a secure perimeter. Here's a number the Ukrainian Defense Ministry released this week that I genuinely can't stop thinking about. Ukrainian drone units have struck more than 1 million targets since the start of 2026 alone, and unmanned drone systems now account for roughly 90% of all Ukrainian military strikes. 90%. Now, I want to be fair here, because that kind of number can be defined in generous ways by any military that wants to make itself look good. Target struck is a loose category. Treat the raw number with some healthy skepticism, but even if you discount it heavily, the ratio itself tells you everything. Ukraine hasn't just added a drone program to its existing army. Ukraine has rebuilt its entire way of fighting a war around drones. The tanks, the artillery, the traditional army it started this war with, that's now the supporting cast. The drones are the main character now. And that brings us to the motorcycles. On July 17th, the same day as those 12 ship strikes, Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov held an official Ministry of Defense board meeting. Deputy ministers were there. The logistics chief was there. According to the Institute for the Study of War's reading of the official meeting summary, the emphasis coming out of that meeting was on improving the mobility of assault units through the procurement of small motorized vehicles, motorcycles, buggies, all-terrain vehicles. The Institute for the Study of War's assessment of this is direct and blunt. Russia's Ministry of Defense appears committed to optimizing its forces for continued grinding, positional warfare, not for the kind of fast, mechanized breakthrough it would actually need to make large territorial gains. Now, before you assume this is pure stupidity, let's be fair, because there's a real legitimate argument for the motorcycles. In a battlefield saturated with drones watching everything from above, a slow-moving column of armored vehicles is basically a shooting gallery, an easy, obvious target. A fast, scattered group of small vehicles is genuinely harder for enemy drone operators to track and hit. In that narrow sense, this is a real adaptation. It's not a foolish decision on its own, but look closely at what that decision actually concedes. It concedes that Russia will keep grinding forward in 100-meter increments, at a brutal cost in infantry lives. It concedes that there is no major breakthrough coming, not this year. And most importantly, it says absolutely nothing about the problem that actually defines this entire month of the war. The fact that Russia cannot protect anything valuable that sits more than a few hundred kilometers behind its own front line. Not its strategic bombers, not its oil refineries, not its tankers, not its own ports. That is what hasn't been learned. Not a tactical lesson, a strategic one. The entire theory of how this war works. Before we continue into the final and most important part of this story, here's your third check-in. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who actually wants to understand what's happening in this war, not just watch clips of explosions. So do me a quick favor, tap that share button and send this to one person who still thinks this war is only about frontline trenches. Because after this next part, you'll understand why that's not even close to true anymore. While Ukraine has spent 2026 building a war fought hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers away from any trench, Russia's response has stayed largely unchanged for over 2 years. Launch more Shahed-style drones at Ukrainian cities and hope the civilian population breaks before the government does. That happened again overnight into July 17th. Ukraine's Air Force reported that Russia launched 1 Kh-31P anti-radiation missile, 7 Kh-59 and Kh-69 guided missiles, and 130 drones, all in a single night. Ukrainian air defenses managed to shoot down or jam 5 of the missiles and 115 of the drones. But 2 missiles and 8 drones still got through, striking 7 separate locations. Odessa took the worst of it. 2 people were killed, 6 were injured, including 3 children. 11 residential buildings were damaged in the city's Kajibay district, along with a preschool and a religious building. This was the second deadly strike on Odessa in just 3 days. An earlier missile attack on July 14th had already killed 3 people. President Zelensky also confirmed that Russian forces struck Odessa Oblast with at least 15 glide bombs that same period, killing 2 more people and injuring 5. Across the entire country, in that single 24-hour window, 7 people were killed and 67 were injured. Ukraine's energy ministry reported power outages across 5 separate regions: Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhzhia, Odessa, Sumy, and Kherson. Russia's own defense ministry described these strikes as continued attacks on Ukrainian ports it claims are being used for military cargo. It also claimed to have shot down 243 Ukrainian drones overnight that same Friday. Even if you discount that number heavily, and you probably should, think about what it actually confirms. Moscow itself is admitting, in its own official statement, the sheer scale of what's now flying toward it every single night. Here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. Both sides are attacking each other's maritime and economic infrastructure right now. But the symmetry between them is false, and it's worth saying that plainly without dancing around it. Russia is striking a port city belonging to a country whose export economy is already choked off, killing civilians in their own apartment buildings. Earlier this month, in one especially disturbing case, 5 civilian sailors were killed aboard a Togo-flagged cargo ship that was simply unloading fertilizer. Ukraine, on the other hand, is striking the physical machinery that converts Russian oil into Russian government revenue. One campaign produces casualties and international outrage. The other produces a shortfall on a government ledger somewhere in Moscow. And here's the thing worth remembering. Only one of those 2 outcomes actually compounds over time. And you can watch it compounding if you know exactly where to look. Russia is reportedly now turning to India to import gasoline. Read that sentence one more time. One of the largest hydrocarbon-producing countries on the entire planet, importing refined fuel from another nation. There are reports of long lines at gas stations in Novosibirsk, reports of fuel rationing beginning to appear in some regions. The Institute for the Study of War's July 17th assessment noted that Russia's wartime spending priorities and broader economic policy choices appear to be driving a wider economic decline inside the country. It also noted that a Russian state-affiliated pollster recorded one of the sharpest drops in President Putin's approval rating since the war began, following months of slow, steady erosion. Pay attention to that detail. State-affiliated. That's not a Western pollster with an agenda. That's Russia's own instrument, and it's registering the decline. Then there's Crimea, and honestly, the reporting coming out of the peninsula right now reads almost like fiction. Mobile phone service is now available only around 8 hours a day, and only during daylight hours, according to Russian-installed local authorities themselves. Power blackouts have become routine, almost expected. More than 20 separate explosions were reported during one overnight drone attack this week alone. The Institute for the Study of War has been tracking, since early July, how Ukraine's interdiction campaign is steadily degrading Russia's ability to move fuel and sustain its own logistics into Crimea. That's the entire point behind hitting fuel tankers crossing the Sea of Azov toward the peninsula. Cut the fuel, and you cut everything that depends on it. And there's another layer to this that's easy to miss. Those same strikes are also steadily wearing down Russian air defense systems, which creates a genuine compounding problem. You cannot simultaneously defend ports, air bases, power substations, fuel depots, and bridges with a shrinking number of defense systems. Every single night, someone in Russia's command structure has to choose what gets protected and what gets left exposed. And then, on July 17th, something else surfaced. A group known for monitoring internal Russian communications published what it claims is an urgent internal telegram sent by Admiral Sergei Pinchuk, commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet and head of the Sevastopol garrison. The document reportedly orders units across the garrison to compile lists of military families and civilian employees for possible evacuation, with those lists due by July 10th. A regional outlet reported the story, but was clear that it could not independently verify the document's authenticity. I'm repeating that caution deliberately, because forged documents are practically their own genre in this war, and skepticism here is healthy. But this claim doesn't stand completely alone. Back in June, a separate partisan monitoring network reported that fleet officers were already quietly moving their own families out to Novorossiysk, ahead of any formal evacuation order, and selling off property they couldn't take with them. Their apparent assessment was that maintaining command operations in Sevastopol had simply become too dangerous and too expensive to justify. Sevastopol isn't just another Russian city. It's the entire reason Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014 in the first place. It's the fixed point around which Russia's entire southern military strategy has been built for over a decade. The warm water naval base, the platform for projecting power across the Black Sea, the thing the whole map was quite literally drawn around. If the fleet's own officers are quietly relocating their wives and children out of that city, that isn't a small military logistics update. That's a verdict. And it helps explain something else that's been happening. Why the fighting around the Kherson sector has gone unusually quiet lately. Quiet, in a war like this one, almost never means peace is coming. Quiet usually means somebody can no longer afford to be loud. Sustained pressure on the supply routes running through Chonhar and across the Sea of Azov, the arteries that have carried fuel, ammunition, and equipment into southern Ukraine since 2022, reduces the tempo any military force can generate, even if its underlying intentions haven't changed at all. You simply don't launch large offensives when you're carefully rationing diesel fuel. Meanwhile, the Institute for the Study of War reports that Ukrainian counterattacks in the Oleksandrivka direction have reportedly recovered 6 settlements and roughly 120 square kilometers of territory, supported directly by exactly this kind of long-range strike campaign against supply lines. That's the actual shape of Ukraine's theory of victory heading into the rest of 2026, and it's genuinely worth saying out loud, because it looks nothing like what most people picture when they imagine what winning a modern war looks like. There's no dramatic breakthrough here, no armored column racing to the sea, no sudden collapse of the front line you could screenshot and post online. Ukraine isn't trying to defeat the Russian army in open battle. Ukraine is trying to make the Russian army financially unaffordable to keep in the field, to raise the real cost of every liter of fuel, every artillery shell, every barrel of exported oil, every single bomber sortie, until the math in Moscow simply stops working. It's attrition of logistics, not attrition of soldiers. It's slower, it's far less dramatic to watch unfold, And it's extremely difficult to reverse because the things being destroyed, oil refineries, specialized ship hulls, strategic bombers, port cranes, high voltage power substations, are exactly the kinds of assets a heavily sanctioned economy cannot quickly replace, and in some cases, cannot replace at all. There's one more piece to this puzzle, and honestly, it might matter more to viewers outside this war than anything else we've covered so far. According to Wall Street Journal reporting, former President Trump's posture toward Ukraine has reportedly shifted in recent weeks. And the reason wasn't a lobbying campaign or a dramatic summit speech or emotional pressure from allies. It was classified intelligence briefings on the actual effectiveness of Ukraine's domestically produced long-range drones. Officials who attended those briefings described Trump as genuinely impressed by the ingenuity coming out of Ukraine's own defense industry. This is the same man who, back in February 2025, reportedly told Zelensky that Ukraine had no leverage left, no cards to play. After a NATO summit held in Ankara on July 8th, European officials described a noticeably more supportive tone coming from Washington, including a new license allowing Ukraine to manufacture Patriot missile interceptors domestically. Trump's own reported words afterward were that there's a lot of pressure building on Putin, and that Putin doesn't seem to like the direction things are heading. Whatever your personal opinion of the man, the policies, or the politics involved, focus on the actual mechanism at play here. Ukraine didn't change American foreign policy through diplomacy, through speeches, or through emotional appeals. It changed policy through demonstrated industrial capability. Ukraine built something that genuinely worked, at real scale, cheaply. And the technical briefing slides did the persuading, not the politicians. That's a lesson about how real leverage actually gets built in the year 2026, and it applies to a lot more than just this one war. So let's finally answer the question this video's title asks, honestly, including the part that cuts the other way and gives Russia real credit. Has Russia truly learned nothing at all? Not quite. That wouldn't be fair to say. Russia has learned to disperse its forces. It has learned to buy motorcycles and lighter vehicles to survive drone-saturated battlefields. It has learned to strike back at Ukrainian gas stations, postal depots, and grain terminals in something close to a mirror image campaign. More than 150 Ukrainian filling stations have reportedly been hit over the past 2 months alone. It has learned to redirect its oil exports and to lean on countries like India for refined fuel when its own refineries can't keep up. These are real adaptations. They're not stupid decisions made in a vacuum. But here's what Russia hasn't learned, and this is the actual thesis of everything we've covered today. Every single one of those adaptations still assumes this war is primarily a contest over terrain, decided within 100 kilometers of a trench line, where raw endurance beats precision every time. Russia is optimizing itself for the war it originally prepared to fight. Ukraine has spent all of 2026 quietly building a completely different war, one fought against fuel supplies, ship hulls, aircraft frames, power transformers, and railway lines, hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers from anywhere a single Russian soldier is actually standing. Now, before we close this out, one final honest caveat. Because I'd genuinely rather you hear this from me than discover it somewhere else later. Most of the specific operational numbers in this story come directly from Ukrainian sources. The 159 vessels figure is Bravdy's own count, not the result of an independent international audit. The destruction of the Tu-95 bomber rests on statements from Ukraine's security service and drone footage, not third-party confirmation. The Sevastopol evacuation order is, by every honest account, an unverified leak. But the broader pattern underneath all of it is corroborated by sources that have no reason to exaggerate in Ukraine's favor. Independent tanker tracking data from Bloomberg, ongoing assessments from the Institute for the Study of War, confirmations from Russian regional governors about drone threats in their own territories. Even Moscow's own admissions about the sheer volume of drones it claims to be shooting down every single night. Individual numbers in a war like this one are always the most confident version of an uncertain truth. But what I genuinely tell you not to do is dismiss this entire story just because some individual details still need independent verification. Because it's the second-order evidence here that becomes almost impossible to argue against. Russian refinery throughput sitting at a 21-year low. 135 million barrels of crude oil sitting idle on the ocean because buyers won't lift it fast enough. Gasoline lines forming in Siberian cities, 8 hours of phone service a day in Sevastopol, a fleet commander's staff reportedly drawing up lists of who gets evacuated first. None of that comes from a press release written to impress anyone. All of it flows downstream from the exact same underlying campaign. 12 more ships hit on July 17th, 159 in 12 days. A strategic bomber destroyed that can never be rebuilt, because the factory that made it closed its doors 33 years ago, and a defense ministry that spent that very same afternoon in a meeting room discussing all-terrain vehicles. At some point, the real question stops being how many ships Russia can afford to lose, It becomes something much harder and much more uncomfortable to sit with. What actually happens to a state whose entire strategy was built on the assumption that it could simply outlast everyone else, when it turns out that the thing actually running out isn't its will to fight, and isn't even its soldiers? It's the physical, mechanical ability to move fuel from where it sits to where the war actually needs it. That's not a story about ships anymore. That's a story about a system quietly running out of road. And whether Moscow figures that out before it's too late, or whether it just keeps buying motorcycles instead, that's the question worth watching closely over the next few months, not the next few headlines. If this breakdown actually helped you understand something you didn't before today, that's exactly why this channel exists. So subscribe, ring the notification bell if you don't want to miss the next one, and I'll see you in the next video, where we go even deeper